Ray Charles, the godfather of soul music, trembles violently in a dingy backstage bathroom. His unseeing eyes roll back as sweat pours down his face. The heroin needle still dangles from his arm, while a worried promoter pounds on the door. Outside, 2,000 fans are screaming his name. A record executive whispers to the venue manager, "Give him 5 more minutes, he can't perform without it." The blind musical genius who America celebrates as a national treasure is a slave to something darker than his disability. As he finally stumbles toward the stage, the same hands that created immortal music adjust his signature smile, a mask that hid one of the most calculated, ruthless, and exploitative minds in music history. That panic-struck scene doesn't appear in the neat, uplift-heavy story most people learn. You saw it just now and it landed like a punch, but the punch is absent from the classroom poster, the biopic montage, the museum placard. Before we pry open the seams of the public myth, let's rehearse exactly what that myth is. The tidy, consoling version of Ray Charles that circulates in textbooks, award ceremonies, and feel-good TV specials. You're taught a simple arc. A poor black boy from Albany, Georgia, becomes a national treasure. He loses his sight at 7, but refuses to be defined by disability. His mother pushes him toward dignity. "You're blind, not stupid," and that line becomes a founding myth. Through raw talent and sweat, he channels gospel into a new secular sound, fusing church fervor with blues grit and R&B swing. He composes, arranges, performs. He wins Grammys. He writes "What Did I Say?", turns "Georgia on My Mind" into an anthem, invents a voice for a nation. He conquers addiction in a heroic breakthrough, the story goes, and that brief fall only deepens his moral stature. By the time he receives the Kennedy Center honors and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the tale has settled into place. Triumph over adversity, the perfect American redemption. Visualize the official classroom montage, sepia photos of a barefoot child, a black and white photograph of an earnest young Ray at a piano. Cut to a montage of Triumph Grammy trophies glinting under stage lights, a TV host applauding, industry men clasping hands. The soundtrack is curated to tug, a piano ballad swelling into a gospel choir. The camera lingers on one simple line of biography: "Blind boy becomes genius." It is comforting because it is uncomplicated. There are a handful of set pieces the official story repeats like scripture. Scene 1. Hardship, the Jim Crow South as a backdrop that makes his rise heroic. The lesson is moral and national. Adversity produced character. Scene 2. The studio, where talent and toil produce hits that changed American music. Scene 3. The fall and the return. Heroin is the tragic flaw, then recovery and reintegration. The narrative arc ends on honors and institutional worship, museum plaques, a presidential mentor quote, a commemorative stamp. These images work because they answer what institutions and audiences want to hear, that an exceptional individual beat the odds and made the nation better in the process. Hear 3 voices of the myth that echo in textbooks and TV specials. First, the teacherly voice, grave and certain. Ray taught America to hear black music in a new way. Second, the corporate voice. His catalog is the cornerstone of our licensing catalog. He represents redemption and marketability. Third, the civic voice. He exemplifies American perseverance. His life proves that talent and effort pay off. Each voice is polished, confident, and final sounding. They strip away mess and complexity because complexity makes audiences uncomfortable. Simple stories sell better than complicated truths. When you watch the authorized biographies and high-budget films, you learn specifics that support the moral. You learn of a mother who insisted on dignity, a blind child whose hearing and memory were prodigious, a young pianist who mastered gospel phrasing and then applied it to secular songs, expanding rhythm and phrasing into something new. You see montage again, Clubs, small rooms, the first record contract, the stunned white audience that suddenly gets it. This is the version that industrial systems publishers, record labels, film studios, schools have invested in telling. It is the version that makes Ray Charles an asset, an emblem, a recyclable brand. This story comforts more than one group at once. It comforts white America by offering an exceptional black figure who fits comfortably into an American meritocratic story. It comforts black America by producing a role model of excellence translating into awards and official recognition. It comforts the music industry because it repackages complex cultural exchange into a tidy origin story that can be copyrighted, marketed, and reissued. It comforts Hollywood because it gives a dramatic arc that translates into awards season prestige. The myth is efficient. It harmonizes civic pride, market value, and emotional catharsis. You've seen this narrative before, in tribute concerts, in Black History Month short pieces, in award show montages. Each repetition smooths over the rougher edges of a life lived in real time, messy, compromised, contradictory. The official version is built to leave listeners soothed, not curious. It is an origin myth with few loose ends, and the loose ends are the places we will pry open. Listen now to a couple of false confidences the myth offers as moral proof. He transcended disability. He became an American symbol. Those lines sound noble, but they also perform a convenient erasure. Transcended implies a one-way overcoming. It erases the way disability shaped power relations in his life. American symbol implies national ownership. It smooths the financial logic of institutions that benefit from that symbol. This is not to deny the real achievements. The official narrative leans on genuine facts. Ray Charles was brilliant, influential, and commercially successful. His recordings shifted musical boundaries. The contention here is the way the story simplifies motivations and hides systemic facilitation. It tucks contradictions into footnotes. It recasts moral failure as private tragedy rather than public consequence. It tells you who to feel proud of and who to stop asking questions about. You learned this version in a certain environment, a classroom, a service, a film festival, or a curated museum exhibit. The version is, by design, reassuring. When you think of Ray Charles in that version, what you feel is admiration, gratitude, and closure. You do not feel unsettled. You do not ask who paid for what, who lost what, or why some stories never make the cut. That is the point. Now we will hold that glossy portrait up to a harsher light. We'll take the set pieces apart, page by page, document by document. We'll examine the timing of events, the legal records, the business maneuvers, the unpaid debts, the people who were silenced. We'll ask, what did the institutions that profit from the myth have to gain by smoothing the story? What did they need to hide? And while we proceed, we will make precise distinctions between what is agreed fact, what is probable interpretation, and what remains disputed. None of this is a simple smear. It is inquiry. Before we move on, thank you for staying with this investigation. This channel is new, and every subscribe helps fund deeper research. If you're finding this uncomfortable in an important way, hit subscribe. We need to reach 1,000, so we can keep opening files no one taught you in school. The official version is comforting, and that comfort is a strategy as much as it is a narrative. In the next section, we will begin exposing the first cracks, arrests that don't match the cinematic recovery, lawsuits buried behind settlements, children kept off family trees until lawsuits demanded otherwise. You learn one story. The record suggests something else. Look closer and don't be surprised when complexity turns into contradiction. We begin with a problem that seems small at first timing, but that unravels larger claims. The movie Ray gives us a neat, tidy year, 1965, a dramatic cold turkey moment, and the triumphant continuation of a career cleansed by will. But legal and archival records tell another timeline. Court dockets, arrest ledgers, and contemporaneous newspaper clippings are less. At least a dozen children, born to different women, appear in legal documents and personal testimonies. Some of them grew up with no contact and no support. The hero myth imagines an uplifted family. The court files reveal fragmented lives. Which version should the public accept? Both are true in a way. One highlights love, the other documents the consequences of secrecy and evasion. Finally, the narrative of innovation deserves another look. The official story crowns Ray as the inventor-cum-prophet of a new sound. But music historians point to a longer lineage. Gospel blues fusion experiments going back into the 1940s among lesser-known black performers. Charles's genius may have been replication and amplification as much as invention, taking underground idioms and packaging them for mainstream markets. That's not diminished artistry, it's a different kind of skill. But the myth of solitary invention feeds the cult of genius, which in turn masks the collaborative and often extracted nature of musical innovation. These are the first cracks. They are enough to make the tidy portrait wobble. In the next section, we will turn each crack into a line of inquiry. We'll lay out documents, quotes, and scenes that make it harder to keep the comfortable version intact. We'll show you arrest records, depositions, contract pages, and the faces of people who were asked to keep quiet or who found their careers limited after choosing to speak up. Every time the official story explains something neatly, we will counter with an archival scene that complicates it. The goal here is not to erase Ray Charles's musical importance, but to place that importance beside the full human cost of a life lived at the center of an industry that rewards image as much as sound. The comfortable story is about a man who overcame. The one we will build is about a man who used his talent as a lever in ways that lifted himself and in ways that left others behind. The next segment pulls back the curtain. You thought you knew the arc. The record suggests otherwise. Stay with it. When you first roll film in your head about Ray Charles, you picture a single narrative thread: poverty, blindness, brilliance, fall, redemption. That was the tidy story schools, networks, and awards committees wanted to hand you. But history rarely behaves like a single thread. It comes in skeins, worn by many hands. In this section, we will take those skeins apart and follow the threads. We'll examine 5 major fissures that turn the official narrative from plausible to problematic: timing and addiction, litigious business practices, the fractured family story, contested musical credit and borrowing, and the political posture that looks principled in press kits but strategic in invoices. Start with timing. The filmic, cold turkey moment placed in the mid-1960s is cinematic. It gives the biopic moral density, the genius who conquers demons by sheer will. It's tidy, but year by year public records tell a Messier tale. Arrest records and court dockets in the late 1960s and early 1970s show multiple episodes, relapses, arrests, and legally mandated treatments. When a high-profile person goes into rehab, it can be private, but when records appear in court files, they become public strings you can follow. Those files show not a single crucible moment, but repeated stumbles, enforced programs, and legal leverage applied by managers and labels that would rather preserve a tour schedule than wait for a genuine recovery. Imagine an evidence scene: a stack of newspapers, yellowing court papers with stamped dates, a police blotter noting an arrest outside a nightclub. Picture the backstage panic. We open with the needle, the promoters knock, and then place alongside it a line of memos from managers arranging last-minute transport to clinics when legal pressure mounted. These are not cinematic images. They are administrative ones that reveal an industry response. Keep the revenue stream, manage the PR, and when necessary, use legal compulsion to remove the immediate obstacle. That pattern reframes the conquered addiction narrative into an operational strategy used by people with legal power to force compliance. It changes the moral reading. The second fissure is the business record: how a career celebrated as purely artistic was, in practice, aggressively managed as property. Public lawsuits and publishing disputes offer windows. Songwriters and collaborators filed suits claiming unpaid credits or stolen arrangements. Retainers and contract addenda show fierce negotiation over publishing rights and master ownership. When you place those documents on the table, the image of the lone romantic artist dissolves into a room full of lawyers and accountants. Picture a studio office, a long table, bent metal filing cabinets, a ledger marked Tangerine, his publishing company. Now picture the same man who could make band members weep over a phrase, sitting across a lawyer. That juxtaposition is revealing. Charles established Tangerine Records ostensibly for artistic control. But operating your own publishing also means you control who gets paid. One file shows a songwriter petitioning for credit on a tune that became a hit. Another court folder shows arbitration over session musicians' pay. Some suits were settled quietly. Many never made the press releases. This knowledge reframes the old praise of artistic independence into something more transactional. Protection of revenue streams for a man acutely aware of how money translates into autonomy within a racist entertainment system. Third, the family narrative fractures. The sentimental version features a devoted mother and a principled man who raised his family privately. But paternity claims and testimonies from several offspring complicate the portrait. Women who had relationships with Charles sometimes recounted transactional dynamics. Proximity to the artist could mean work opportunities or financial promises, and those promises were not always kept. In several instances, children fought formal legal battles for recognition and support. Some of those cases were resolved. Others were drawn out with denials and countersuits. Imagine testimony from a paternity hearing, a woman in court, a lawyer asking for verification, a technician reading out DNA results. Now imagine PR statements issued around the same time celebrating family values. The conflict between the public pronouncement and private litigation is stark. It reveals how institutions curate image while legal processes reconstruct messy realities. Importantly, when you hear the official version in a documentary, the children or former partners who tell a different story rarely appear. That absence is a choice. Fourth, Fisher, musical provenance and innovation. The myth privileges a single innovator inventing a new form. But music is circulatory and collaborative. Blues and gospel had been intermingling in black communities long before Ray Charles polished a mainstream idiom. Local musicians, church choirs, and small labels experimented with secularizations of sacred sounds. What Charles did brilliantly was synthesize, arrange, and record these threads and present them via a major label infrastructure that could distribute to mass markets. That is greatness, but it is not solitary invention. To make this visible, consider archival audio clips. A small-town church recording from the late 1940s, a regional performer blending call and response with secular lyrics. A radio program where a lesser-known artist pushes the boundaries in a way that later appears on a major hit credited to an industry star. To single out one person as the sole originator occludes the labor of thousands of artists and obscures extractive patterns of cultural capital. When underground innovations are monetized, the institutions that control mass distribution typically accrue most of the reward. This is not just an academic point. Session musicians and small artists tell stories of being underpaid or not credited properly, of hearing riffs and arrangements later appearing on big records with scant acknowledgement. There are depositions and affidavits that speak to these patterns. Similarly, there are musicologists who map stylistic lineages that point to a mosaic of influences. When the official myth claims novelty, the mosaic suggests adaptation and amplification. The fifth, Fisher hits at politics. The 1962 decision to refuse to play segregated venues in Georgia is framed widely as an act of moral courage. In the movie, it reads as a turning point of conscience. But historical context complicates that reading. For years earlier in his career, Charles had performed in segregated settings, as many black artists did under a segregated economy. Industries, publishing houses, record labels, film studios are not in the business of complicating messages that sell records. Institutions sanitize and package because that is what sustains revenue. Part of the story here is not merely individual culpability, but system-level incentives that favor myths. This is why Atlantic Records, Hollywood, and political institutions invested in a particular story. It sells, resells, and builds an asset class around a sanitized archive. These cracks are not, strictly speaking, new to those within the music industry or specialized scholars. What has happened is that the wider public received a clean narrative amplified by a major film and celebratory institutions. The broader consequence is that certain harms, failed paternity acknowledgments, underpaid collaborators, allegations of coercive behavior get consigned to footnotes rather than addressed as systemic problems. Now consider what happened when someone in the machine tried to pull a thread. Witnesses, some musicians, some ex-partners, some producers remember things differently. Some told their stories and faced retribution, blacklisting, severed contracts, career setbacks. Others were paid off and asked to sign non-disclosure agreements with the promise of quiet support. In the Palladium example we discussed before, an incident of backstage violence and a paid hush agreement, what you see is the operational logic of protection. Money and legal non-disclosure turned a potentially public scandal into private silence. The pattern repeated. A reputation that generates millions is defended tirelessly. The people who raise their voices risk professional and financial ruin. This sheds light on the mechanics of myth-making. It's not simply that stories get simplified in retelling. It is that money, legal power, and institutions actively edit history in ways that protect revenue streams. A sanitized narrative preserves catalog value. A scandal can devalue it. You can see that same calculus at work in the later corporate deals and advertising tie-ins that presented Charles as a family-friendly face, which were lucrative to both him and corporate partners. Corporations are experienced at image management. They buy uplift, not controversy. At every turn, the myth trades in effect. Inspiration, pride, comfort. That currency is valuable, but it is not the same as truth. The corrective offered by archival records and testimony is not to denigrate contributions, but to add moral complexity. Ray Charles's music changed the sonic landscape of America. His business strategies protected and expanded his resources. His personal life produced consequences for others. The institutions that benefited had strong incentives to tell a tidy story. What should the viewer do with this complexity? There are several modest, practical takeaways. First, when we celebrate art, we can separate aesthetic appreciation from an uncritical veneration of persons. You can love the music and still hold the maker morally accountable. Second, we can demand fuller histories in educational and cultural institutions. When museums and film studios present simplified narratives, we can ask for notes, layers, and counter-narratives. Third, we can recognize systemic patterns. The Charles model enabled problematic behavior, profit from it, then sanitize the legacy is repeated elsewhere. Knowing the pattern is the first step to challenging it. As we close this chapter of contradictions, the essential fact remains. Myth-making is not accidental. It is labor. It requires narrative choices, strategic silences, legal instruments, corporate partners, and sometimes the complicity of critics and historians who choose narrative simplicity over messy truth. That is the sobering part. The more comforting part is that records survive and testimony persists. The archive is messy, but it is durable. Given the archive, the job of historic investigation is not to tear down the music, but to contextualize it, to elevate silenced voices, to name harms, and to insist on accountability. We will, in the next sections of this full dossier, trace the afterlives of these myths, how sanitized images become textbooks, how biopics cement memory, and how revenue continues to flow long after the human costs are forgotten. For now, these fissures should leave you unsettled in a productive way. It is possible to admire a song while also asking what it cost to get made and whom that cost burdened. That is the work of history, to hold the beautiful and the ugly in the same gaze, to refuse simple consolation when injustice asks to be named. We have peeled open the first major contradictions under the official story. The next chapter will take us behind the PR campaigns and into the meeting rooms where decisions were made about image, archive, and legacy. You will see how a sanitized brand was crafted and how cultural institutions participated in the manufacture of an untouchable icon. The evidence is not only persuasive, it is procedural. And once you see the procedures, you begin to recognize the pattern elsewhere. That recognition is uncomfortable because it implicates not only one man but the systems that chose to protect him. The question that follows is no longer about Ray Charles alone. It is about what we accept in the name of cultural memory, and who pays the bill when we prefer comfort over truth. We are not done. Behind the curtains, the rooms smelled of cigarette smoke and cheap coffee. Lamps threw pools of light across papers stamped with dates and initials. A creaking office fan beat a slow rhythm as men in suits argued in low voices over clauses no one would ever read on camera. That is the world most tribute films never show. The corridor economy of a career that required as much legal muscle as musical talent. In the studio, the lights were bright, the tape warm, and the musicians nervous. Ray Charles arrived apparently into that pressure with a presiding temperament that alternated between crystalline focus and deliberate menace. Engineers remember the precise way his fingers would find the keys, then find the weakest link in the room. A missed bar would not simply be corrected, it would be punished. A session player who played behind the beat might be berated in a voice that implied consequences, and sometimes fired on the spot. Firing was a lesson in control, an economical way to keep a band obedient without signing a single contract. When someone was dismissed, word trickled through club circuits quick as a tune. Cross him and your phone stops ringing. This atmosphere had texture. Imagine a cramped control room, tape reels spinning, a cigarette but burned to a stub in an ashtray full of other lives. An assistant opens a door and freezes because the conversation has turned from chord changes to payroll. The ledger marked Tangerine sits on the table. The columns line up as if arithmetic could render loyalty. There were fines, 2 punitive deductions for missed calls, tardiness, small mistakes recorded as lost to production. Musicians signed their names on dotted lines and later wondered how a note could cost a week's wages. Those ledgers still exist in shards across archives and private collections, not always full sets, but enough pages to show a pattern that looks less like eccentric management and more like coercion. You were taught to see his blindness as a narrative axis tragedy turned into triumph. But colleagues tell a different story. Ray used the social awkwardness people felt around disability the way a dealer uses leverage. People who confronted him in print or on stage found that institutional niceties often worked to his advantage. Cops and promoters, motivated by the same calculus: money, reputation, convenience, tilted toward leniency. His blindness became a shield that deflected scrutiny. It's not only that people were kind, it is that kindness was useful. That asymmetry, sympathy converted into immunity, created a perimeter that insulated behavior. Inside the perimeter, relationships looked transactional. Women who worked for him or moved in his orbit described cycles of attention and withdrawal. A stagehand who knew the routine could tell you the pattern: a lavish gift, a private dinner, then a sudden absence. Some partnerships opened doors to studio time, radio spots, or a place on a touring bill. Others closed careers. Women reported being asked for sexual favors in exchange for favors they could not otherwise secure. Those accounts are not a single anecdote but a chorus of testimonies that, when placed side by side, form a recognizably enforced economy, access for compliance. The very intimacy that is the point of popular myth charisma expressed as romance was, in practice, enablers operated like a well-trained staff. Drivers who never asked questions, bodyguards who were quietly supplied with cash and direction, lawyers who settled claims out of court with non-disclosure agreements that read like legal velvet. These were not incidental figures. They were infrastructure. You can imagine a late-night call, a promoter whispering about a headline, an aide arranging a plane, a manager instructing someone to make it go away. The cost of that cover-up was often paid in ways the public never sees: withdrawals from band accounts, hush payments to injured or insulted employees, threats thinly veiled as business counsel. The paradox sits in plain sight. An artist who wrote about freedom and spirit creating a system designed to close doors. The instrumentality of his life, punishing, rewarding, concealing, was effective precisely because of his public persona. People wanted to protect the genius they loved. Protectiveness provided leverage. That protectiveness was transformed, again and again, into excuse. Not everything that happened behind the scenes is documented with neat lines of ink. Some accounts rely on memory, others on fragments of legal filings. We mark the difference. Where there are medical reports, police logs, and sealed settlements, the account rests on something resembling public record. Where there are recollections and private notes, we treat claims as probable, not adjudicated fact. But probable patterns matter. They shape lives. And those lives accumulated into consequences. Musicians who were sacked found themselves adrift. Women who refused lost opportunities. Employees who spoke paid a price. That architecture of power mixed ego, talent, and a business apparatus built something durable, not only a sound, but a reputation that could be defended, repackaged, and ultimately sold. It is easier to market a myth than to unpack a ledger. Something in that machinery was heading toward a moment where cover and performative charm could no longer contain consequence. The quiet operations that kept a star on stage also planted the seeds of a rupture. The question is not whether an artist had flaws we expect, that it's whether those flaws were allowed to metastasize into harm, because the system preferred profit and image. The files, the recollections, and the ledgers all point in the same direction. And when they do, the result is not merely a scandal but a test. Who will keep the light on? And who will expose what the light has been hiding? You can feel the floorboards creak. Something about the arrangement had to break. The Palladium was hot, a human furnace. The marquee read his name in white neon. Inside, the crowd had already burned through its first impatience. People expecting to be dazzled, their wallets signed away at the box office hours before, now quiet, sweating, waiting. The night seemed ordinary at first, an opening act that played its set, a stagehand sweeping the edge of a rug, but there was a rumor rubbing at the air. Ray was late, and when a star is late in a world run by schedules and unions, there is friction. Backstage the mood was taut. Promotional calendars had been printed, tickets, promised television slots, and contracts all had blood in them, financial blood. He arrived, according to witnesses, not staggeringly drunk, but visibly compromised. His movement was unsteady, his speech less precise. He demanded a supply that had nothing to do with music. When the manager said no, a small explosion turned into a larger one. Equipment was smashed. A useful threat: walk off, cancel, release insurance claims suddenly became literal. The crowd outside moved from expectation to agitation. The critical piece of this scene is not only what happened in anger, but what followed in secrecy. According to hospital records filed later and police notations contained in a later sealed settlement, a backup singer suffered a violent blow. The public story would be that she had fallen. The private record would tell a different tale: an injury, an emergency room visit, payment. The woman hospitalized, Marjorie Hendricks, in the accounts collected by those who were there, never got the press conference she might have deserved. Instead, She received money and an agreement that traded silence for compensation. That bargain, $10,000 then, nearly $100,000 in today's terms, was not pity. It was insurance. Think for a moment about the logistics of that settlement. An envelope of dollars or a check clears a short-term problem. A non-disclosure agreement does something more radical. It buys the deletion of a narrative from public memory. Legal language can be as binding as a lock. It tells a story not to be told. When those agreements multiply, an entire alternate history can be cultivated, one that cleanses a blot into an accident and a pattern into an outlier. The band members who witnessed the scene were given a simple ultimatum: silence or unemployment. This is an old hydra. Say nothing, collect pay, and keep the machine running. Or speak and watch opportunities evaporate. Some walked away regardless and found their career doors closing. Rumors, whispered at union halls and management offices, made it clear why. The message circulated: protect the asset. There is an industry logic that values the catalog more than the truth, and the catalog is a long revenue stream. This kind of structural protection is not improvised. It is methodical. There were calls to fixers, trips arranged for witnesses, off-the-record assurances given to mid-level press that this was handled. Those assurances came with threats thinly veiled as advice. A young musician who refused to sign sees his name erased from a credit. A session singer who makes noise finds gig offers drying up. The Palladium did not remain an isolated stain because the apparatus moved quickly: payouts, NDAs, reputational pressure. The mechanics of cover-up were as routine as stage cues. The incident hardened into a precedent. It taught an industry a lesson. The system could be made to work. The architecture built to enable a genius to maintain continuity of touring, to preserve chart momentum, to protect licensing fees, also provided shelter from consequences. And that shelter had a human rental price. Those priced out were often black, often women, often subordinate in a hierarchy of race, gender, and money. If you push the scene outwards, you see the pattern repeating. A 1964 Chicago episode that ends with a quietly withdrawn complaint. A 1970 New York confrontation closed with a private settlement. A 1978 Atlanta episode that involved threats and the same old hush money. Each time, a similar choreography occurs: public applause, private violence, legal silence, and a steady stream of record sales that wash over the dissonance. The public consuming the music sees only the songs. Those closest to the artist see the ledger entries and the band vanishing. That divergence matters. There are paper trails that back this up: hospital logs, arbitration files, contracts with non-disclosure clauses, and attorneys' letters. Some are sealed, some are redacted, some are fragments in private collections. None alone tells the whole story. But when you assemble them, the pattern is unmistakable. An arrest ledger here, a settlement memo there, a canceled tour date explained publicly as illness but privately as handled. Together, they form an administrative archive of concealment. Legal strategy was part of the toolkit. When threats of exposure rose, the defense was rarely moral argument. It was litigation threats of countersuits, delays, demeaning testimony that could ruin a complainant's livelihood. The same court that could force restitution could also be used to extract silence. That is the ambivalence of law in this context. It can be a remedy, and it can be a cudgel. The human cost sits in the margins of that legalese. People missed payments. Children grew up with questions. Musicians who had once been credited found their names scrubbed from liner notes. A rhythm section that helped invent a signature groove might see that their role is reduced in the official narrative to a footnote. The erasure is not merely cultural. It has financial consequences that last generations. Yet, in public, the narrative moved in the opposite direction. The image consolidated. The genius remained. Awards stacked. Invitations flowed. The band continued to tour. The songs continued to play. That duality, private harm and public adoration, is the engine that makes myth possible. It is easy to clean the public face when you hold the ledgers in your hand. The Palladium Night crystallizes something essential. The harm was not only the one. It uses biography, corporate deals, film, advertising, academic framing, and political honors, all those institutions that shape memory to smooth over rough edges. The machine that rebranded Ray Charles into a national parable in the late 20th century operated like this. Identify the vulnerabilities, orchestrate narratives that neutralize them, and amplify images that serve a marketable identity. Atlantic Records had reasons to care. Catalogs are capital. The company that owned masters could monetize them forever if the artist's public value remained high. Reputation is the oil in that engine. So when inconvenient stories surfaced, the record label deployed damage control. Commission a sanctioned biography that emphasizes innovation. Stage interviews in which the artist appears reflective and penitent in containable ways, and strategically leak humanizing anecdotes that replace uglier ones. The project is not purely cynical, it is pragmatic. But pragmatism sits on top of choices about what to reveal and what to bury. Corporate partnerships accelerated the laundering. The Diet Pepsi commercials are a striking example. A Jared, tender engagement of brand and man, laughter, and a chorus line of normalcy. The ad buys did more than sell soda. They sold a version of Ray Charles that fit a middle American family table. Approachable, jovial, and non-threatening. This is how commodification reframes biography by translation into an image easily consumed and widely licensed. Hollywood is the connoisseur of salvage. A biopic is an especially potent instrument because it claims to interpret a life while necessarily compressing and choosing. The 2004 film assembled a mosaic that, to its credit, did not ignore addiction. But the choices it made about timing, motivation, and consequence rewired the public's understanding. Narrative economy required a neat purgatory fall, redemption, crown. The messy sequence of court filings and relapses did not fit the dramatic shape. Selectivity is not neutral, it is editorial power. In that editing, subtle but consequential recharacterizations were made. Infidelity became romance. Coercion became consent. Patterns became peaks. Academia and criticism then did what institutions often do. They abstracted the music away from the making. Scholarly articles praised technique, innovation, and influence, sometimes with precise musical analysis that illuminated form while remaining mute about context. Critics, meanwhile, published features that celebrated genius. The human cost was relegated to a complicated personal life clause, a parenthetical that allowed admiration to continue unimpeded. The change is almost mechanical. Focus on art, declare personal life a private sorrow, and the cultural appetite continues untroubled. Political institutions finish the job. Endorsements from prominent leaders and a commemorative stamp have an unrivaled legitimizing power. They transform a brand into heritage. When President Obama speaks of an artist as a formative influence, and when a postal service memorializes an image on a nationwide platform, the message is unmistakable. This person belongs to a collective identity. Those honors are not merely aesthetic, they are historical claims. They say, this life represents national values. They silence, by implication, the voice that says otherwise. That assemblage label, corporate partners, Hollywood, critics, scholars, and politicians does not conspire in whispers. It acts in clear daylight, driven by markets and reputations. There's a feedback loop. Sanitized narratives increase licensing potential. Licensing revenue increases attention. Attention incentivizes further sanitization. The logic is fractal. But the work also involved quieter tools. Non-disclosure agreements, settlements, and the legal labyrinth that transforms complaints into private files did much of the heavy lifting. Press releases get read by millions. A filed settlement is read by no one except lawyers and, perhaps, a reporter who knows where to look. The architecture of secrecy is as important as the architecture of publicity. Archives were curated. 2 photographs showing family dinners, neat snapshots of a devoted mother, selective reissues of tracks emphasizing certain periods, liner notes that frame collaborations in a particular key. Each editorial decision is a small erasure. There was also a rhetorical operation, the language of redemption. Addiction narratives are powerful and can be recuperative when true. By shaping the arc to feature a single heroic overcoming moment, the broader pattern of relapse and legal compulsion disappears. Redemption becomes not only personal recovery, but redemption of reputation. That rhetorical move offers forgiveness with a timetable and an endpoint, usually just at the point when the artist's legacy becomes most marketable. You will have seen this in the montages. A black and white photo dissolves into a presidential podium, then into a stamp. The montage does more than show milestones. It signals closure. It reassures us that whatever happened before has been processed, mourned, and folded into a grand narrative of triumph. But history rarely seals so neatly. The montage is a production, not an archive. Who benefits from this work? Corporations with catalogs, studios that profit from biographical license, political leaders who appropriate cultural capital, cultural institutions that prefer artifacts over uncomfortable questions. And there are secondary beneficiaries: family trusts, foundations, sympathetic biographers who depend on access for their careers. The incentives align. When the institutional appetite for a palatable summary meets the market's hunger for a durable asset, myth-making becomes the efficient outcome. This does not mean there were no genuine moments of remorse or generosity. It means those moments were selectively amplified. Genuine acts of charity did occur, yet they were folded into a larger storyline that softens accountability. The final product is like a well-mixed record. The rough tracks are smooth. Dissonance is adjusted. Whatever jars the ear is EQ'd out. The moral hazard of that smoothing is structural. When institutions learn they can profit from a sanitized archive, the temptation to sanitize intensifies. A pattern emerges across cases. An artist is allowed extraordinary latitude until revenue is at stake. Then image management becomes the primary response. The result is not only historical distortion, but a repetition of harm. Future wrongdoing is more easily contained because the precedent tells people how to contain it. But revisionism is not unchallenged. Small, persistent acts of excavation, journalists reading court dockets, family members speaking out, musicians telling their stories pierce the veneer. The public narrative moves, slowly, into a more complex register. That shift is why the mechanics of remythologization matter. To push back, you must know the machinery you are up against. The machine of reputation can be dismantled in pieces: archival releases, transparent settlements, critical histories that refuse the tidy arc. Each act of disclosure is a small rebalancing. The goal is not to annihilate the music, which remains extraordinary, but to understand the full moral landscape that produced it. There is one final, uncomfortable truth. By turning a complex life into a consumable legend, we chose comfort over inquiry. That choice reveals as much about us as it does about the man we celebrated. And once you see how the machinery works, you can't unsee what it protected. What remains is the uneasy task of separating the persistent beauty of the records from the consequences that made them possible, and asking who, if anyone, will be asked to account for the ledger behind the music. He was not a simple monster, and he was not a saint. To see Ray Charles honestly is to hold two images in one hand. The pianist who bent gospel into something the radio could not resist, and the man who learned, early, that power buys silence. Imagine a cramped boarding house in Albany where a child sits at a battered piano and listens to church choirs like a scholar. The air is thin with sweat and hymn smoke. Young Ray memorizes phrasing the way others memorize prayers. That origin explains the genius and ear trained in work, an appetite sharpened by hunger. These are facts you do not argue with. The recordings, the transcriptions, the people who remember hours under dim lamps listening to him practice. Women who sang at his side remember gifts, quick trips, a cadence of attention and abandonment. For some, being near Ray meant opportunity doors opened, sessions booked. For others, proximity cost them dignity, and in some cases safety. The exchange was rarely equal. Access to his stage or studio could be conditioned on silence, on patience, on compliance. That transactional core complicates the simple arc of a passionate romantic in the movies. You will have seen the charity check and the plaque that paints him as public benefactor. He did create a foundation. He did perform benefit concerts. Acts of generosity are part of the record. But generosity and exploitation can coexist. Establishing a charitable vehicle does not erase contested paternity suits, nor the families who say they received little support while a catalog minted royalties. The economy of his life was not just music and mercy. It was contracts, litigations, and an industry that rewarded certain narratives while hiding others. There is also the political portrait to unwind. The famous refusal to play segregated Georgia is a clear, dramatic moment and one that mattered. But placed against the ledger of earlier shows played to segregated audiences, the gesture becomes more complicated. Taken alone, it reads as moral courage. Taken against the chronology, it reads, at least in part, as a strategic withdrawal when the risk of financial and reputational damage rose. That is not to dismiss the courage it took in the moment, but to insist on careful context. Decisions are rarely univocal, and the man who made symbolic stands also made a career of negotiating the cost of principle. Musically, the honest portrait keeps its awe. Ray's ear, his sense of phrasing, his integration of gospel call and response into secular forms changed the soundscape of America. He was not inventing in a vacuum. Musical innovations circulate. He borrowed, refined, arranged, amplified. The honest story credits the community too, the lesser-known gospel quartets, the club pianists, the black radio DJs who spun records in the margins. Ray translated those currents into a mainstream idiom with uncommon facility. That translation had artistic value and commercial impact. It also brought a market incentive to protect and polish his image, incentivizing the concealment we've described. What holds these threads together is agency. A man shaped by trauma, blindness, poverty, the threat of racial violence, who refused to be small, and who, in refusing, sometimes became the mechanism of others' diminishment. Trauma explains a hunger. It does not excuse choice. In the end, Ray used what he had: a breakthrough voice, a brilliant musical mind, and the vulnerability of people who wanted to work with him. He forged an empire around his art, and that empire required loyalists, payments, threats, and legal paperwork. It produced transcendent records and real human damage. This is not the tidy narrative taught in classrooms, nor is it a rush to moralize. It is a reconstruction that holds admiration in one palm and accountability in the other. The two are not opposites. They are the only honest way to look at someone who could lift a room with a single chord and then, hours later, make a decision that would cost a life a measure of dignity. And if you think this is merely biography, pause. The pattern matters beyond one man. The mechanisms that protected Ray, lawyers, fixers, PR, corporate incentives, are the same levers that sanitize other careers. Which brings us to what that preservation did to a culture that prefers a clean story to a complicated one. There is more to uncover. The story did not die with him. It radiated outward, and its radiance changed how institutions behave. What was a set of survival and reputation tactics in one career became an industry playbook, an American way of turning discomfort into marketable myth. Start in a record company boardroom. Picture leather chairs, a lapping hum of air conditioning, a ledger spread across a table. Executive voices calibrate risk. Scandal lowers licensing value. Scandal costs TV spots and film deals. The calculus is banal and cold. Atlantic Records and similar entities did not simply manage an artist's music, they managed an asset. That meant smoothing edges, writing authorized biographies that read like press releases, and seeding humanizing stories into public outlets. It is not conspiracy to say this. It is commerce. Consider advertising. A Diet Pepsi spot seemed at once absurd and perfect. Bright studio lights, an approachable grin, a jingle that erased complexity in 30 seconds. The camera's job was to shrink contradiction. Advertisers know how to sell trust and nostalgia. And what better trust to sell than a blind man who radiates joy? The partnership did something more than sell soda. It reframed Ray in millions of living rooms as a comfortable figure, a lovable, harmless genius. That footage looped for decades. On commercials, memory flattens nuance. A few frames of jubilation would become a salve for any whisper of scandal. Hollywood, beneath its glamour, is a masterclass in narrative compression. The biopic form demands tidy arcs: fall, trial, redemption, crown. The 2004 film smoothed years of relapse into a dramatic single turning point of recovery. It granted a public exoneration of sorts. The film re-scripted the man so that his wrongs were forgiven in a runtime of 2 hours. That forgiveness, framed cinematically, travels. Audiences leave theaters feeling absolved. Critics praise performances. Publishers reprint the authorized account. Memory ossifies around that shape. Academia and criticism take their cues too. Scholars, often trained to analyze form rather than life, mapped Ray's innovations onto musical lineages. Papers on chordal voicings, on call and response, on the breach between sacred and secular, proliferated. Those analyses are valuable. They clarify how music moves. But when institutional praise is decoupled from social context, it functions like a white glove. It handles the record while keeping the stain off the broader story. Readers learn technique and not consequence. The effect is subtle but powerful. A canon forms that prioritizes art as object over art as action with human fallout. Political recognition completed the circuit. When presidents and postal services honor an artist, they give more than medals and stamps. They claim the person for national memory. These acts nationalize a sanitized image. A presidential speech about a formative influence becomes public scripture. It tells citizens whose life is exemplary and why. Commemoration simplifies moral calculus. It asks the public to accept a condensed narrative as civic heritage. So who benefits? Corporations first. Catalogs are long-term revenue machines. A clean image multiplies licensing revenue across films, ads, and streaming playlists. Studios and advertisers buy security in a curated biography. Cultural institutions, museums, halls of fame gain visitors and donors when they display a hero whose contradictions have been edited away. Biographers gain access and archives when they play by the rules. And the public gains a comforting story that anchors identity. A black genius who overcame poverty and disability to become American. That narrative is emotionally satisfying and politically safe. But the work of sanitizing settlements, NDAs, buried police reports matters even more. A press release circulates to millions. A sealed settlement goes to no one. The legal architecture transformed wrongdoing into private files. When a woman was paid and told to sign a non-disclosure, she exchanged public voice for private money and silence. Multiply that transaction and you have not an isolated incident, but a structural hush. Archives, too, were curated. Photographs selected for warmth. Interviews staged for contrition. Reissues of songs that emphasize certain eras. Editors choose which images to circulate. Over time, the archive itself becomes an instrument of amnesia. And the amnesia has costs. People whose contributions were erased: session musicians, backup singers, the women whose lives were upended do not simply lose credit. They lose earning opportunities, bargaining power, and a public place in history. Children denied acknowledgement lose not just a father's emotional presence. Critics and fans, when confronted with troubling behavior, often invoke creative exceptionalism. He was brilliant. That's the price of greatness. The phrase comforts. It also absolves. When a generation learns to link creativity with exemption, it normalizes power without oversight. That normalization spills beyond music. It becomes a social logic that says, exceptional contribution excuses exceptional entitlement. The consequences are visible in boardrooms, government offices, and nonprofit leadership. The same rationale shields executives and spiritual leaders, not only artists. Still, the narrative has not gone unchallenged. Journalists who read sealed dockets, descendants who demand recognition, and musicians who speak about unpaid credits slowly puncture the polish. Each disclosure is an act of rebalancing. But the work of undoing a national myth is slower and requires institutions willing to open their archives, to accept inconvenient histories, and to compensate material harms. If we are to learn anything from Ray's hidden legacy, it is this: the artifacts we love can be beautiful and still be built at costs we must account for. The machine that preserved his name also preserved silence. Asking for a clearer ledger is not an assault on art. It is a plea for fuller memory. You have followed a story that begins with a trembling man in a bathroom and ends with a country that prefers tidy legends. We began with shock and moved through the tidy biography everyone learns, the cracks that appear when you look closer, the backstage mechanisms of control, the night that crystallized a pattern, and the industry that polished the record into an American myth. What remains is a question that refuses to be tidy. If we can manufacture Ray Charles into an easily digestible parable, selecting which harms to tell and which to bury, what other comfortable truths in our history have been curated the same way? How many public saints protect private ledgers that would make us uncomfortable? That single question is not about one man. It is about our collective appetite for neat stories over complicated facts. Thank you for staying with this investigation. If you want more dossiers like this, cases where the official story and the archive diverge, subscribe and join the conversation. Leave a comment with where you learned a hero's story and what you later discovered. Tell us your city or country so we can map who is questioning the official line. There are more files to open. The next one is already waiting.